and pleased to be back from Washington, D.C. I spent the end of last week there, including attending what has now achieved some notoriety, a usually invisible event of nonpartisan prayer. I went to Donald Trump's first national prayer breakfast, but as well, I met with many people in the Congress and Senate and environmental groups in the U.S. who are facing the reality of Donald Trump as president, and particularly what that means for climate, what that means for pipelines. Je suis heureux et vraiment fier de présenter mon ami, mon collègue, Daphne Wysham, de l'Institut pour l'étude des politiques. Daphne's been running the climate and energy program at the Institute for Policy Studies for a number of years. I just want to set in terms of context and then turn it to Daphne that there are separations of power within the U.S. In the last number of weeks since the inauguration, it's been described as a shock and awe campaign of President Trump, signing executive orders and leaving people reeling. And as we've been reeling from the immigration ban and from various other executive orders that are breathtaking, the attack and the assault on U.S. climate policy hasn't been getting quite as much attention, nor has the fact that Donald Trump can't get his way on climate as easily as he thinks he can, just as he has discovered he can't get his way on immigration as easily as he thinks he can. But there are real threats, there are tricky waters, and we hope to shine a light on what we hope Prime Minister Justin Trudeau can do for Canada and for the world. And the big question, how does one approach a Trump presidency and meet the targets of the Paris Agreement? So with that as preamble, I turn the microphone over to Daphne Wysham.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm Daphne Wysham with the Center for Sustainable Economy in Portland, Oregon, as well as with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. We are facing right now in the United States an unprecedented situation in our history. A president who not only has tried to impose a ban on Muslims entering the country and impose a Muslim registry. He's nominated an oil executive to head up our U.S. State Department, and he's appointed climate deniers to virtually every position of power, including NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency. Members of Congress are proposing to eliminate the EPA altogether. We have directors of various government agencies whose only expertise is that they have called for the elimination of these government agencies, and an arbitrary Trump policy of eliminating 2 government regulations for every one that is put in place under his administration. Clearly, a man who tweets out this morning that all negative polls are fake news is a man who is not to be believed. Unfortunately, this is a man who is in charge of the world's most powerful nation, who has threatened to pull out of the Paris Agreement and potentially out of the UN climate agreement as well. The good news is that cities and states throughout the United States are fighting back, just as the judge from Washington State pushed back on the ban on Muslims. We have cities and states that are moving full steam ahead on the agenda on climate change. I recently wrote for The Nation an article on my city, Portland, Oregon, which recently imposed a ban on all new fossil fuel export infrastructure. We have over 30 elected officials in the U.S. and Canada and some in Australia who are endorsing this move to ban all new fossil fuel export infrastructure and have pledged to do the same in their areas of jurisdiction, including the mayor of Richmond, California, home to the largest oil refinery on the West Coast, the mayor of Santa Barbara, the mayor of Vancouver, BC, and Elizabeth May. We are not going to take this assault on our rights to a clean air and clean water sitting down, just as the Standing Rock Sioux have shown the U.S. what courage looks like, what standing up for their rights as Native Americans looks like. We intend to stand up for the rights of First Nations and Native Americans if this Keystone XL pipeline is pushed through, as Donald Trump claims he will do. The resistance has only begun. We will see people putting tractors and cattle in the way of these pipelines that are being prepared through Nebraska. There will be court challenges. We've only begun to resist the Trump agenda. I'll be taking some questions, if there are any, for either one of us.
Merci. Pour un petit résumé en français, c'est clair que dans les États-Unis, ce n'est pas facile pour M. Trump de gagner tout son horaire de destruction des lois et règlements environnementaux. Il y a autour des États-Unis les groupes écolos, les autochtones, les personnes dont les municipalités, les maires qui sont engagés pour arrêter les changements contre le défi du changement climatique. On doit agir et dans les États-Unis, c'est clair qu'il y a un grand nombre de personnes, des groupes, des organisations qui sont contre le but de M. Trump. En même temps, il y a dans le monde un grand besoin pour quelqu'un qui peut devenir un leader, un vrai leader pour le changement climatique. J'espère que peut-être il sera M. Trudeau. For me as a Canadian, I'm hoping that the Canadian government can step up and do much more on climate, resist the calls from people like Premier Brad Wall or Ronna Ambrose and the Conservative Party that Canada should do less. This is a moment where all the other parties to the Paris Agreement, but particularly Canada as a close trading partner to the U.S., should make it clear that we need to do more if the U.S. does less. It's not a case of a political agenda that can shift. It's the real threat of climate change, which is not hypothetical, is happening every day and worsening. And to protect our Arctic, to protect our coastlines, to protect our agriculture, Canada will need to do much more. And we will also need to have as clear a message as possible to President Trump that moving away from reaching the Paris Agreement is simply not going to be acceptable to the rest of the world and the rest of the parties to that agreement. So I think that's our opening statement, and we're both open for any questions you might have.
I have a question about the Trump effect here in Canada, because it was not long after the U.S. election that Prime Minister Trudeau announced approval of 2 pipelines. Mm-hmm. And then he also welcomed the Keystone Pipeline Agreement and so on. Does this concern you at all about whether there might already be a Trump effect on Canada that is making Prime Minister Trudeau a little worried about what might happen to the economy if the free trade agreement is opened up and mm-hmm. other sorts of things?
I have to say I try to be very measured about this. The political dynamic that led to the approval of Kinder Morgan and Enbridge Line 3, I believe, are not connected to any internal politics in the U.S. It was entirely about the politics within Canada of the federal Liberals trying to do something to assist the Alberta New Democrats. It seems to me that it was internal politics, and if anything, they missed what they should have considered, which was why approve a glut of pipelines knowing that Trump is likely to approve Keystone? The Liberal Party has been wishy-washy on where they stand on almost every pipeline, but they were always clear that they supported Keystone. So when Bob Rae was interim leader of the Liberal Party, he made it clear in Parliament to Stephen Harper, why don't you bring us down to Washington? We support Keystone. So I think I don't want to jump on that bandwagon too soon. I also think it's important to note that when asked, both Catherine McKenna, Minister of Environment, and the Prime Minister have said, no, it doesn't change our carbon pricing plan in order, because Trump is in the White House. And I think it's one of the things that I worry about in domestic politics is how much climate action has the Prime Minister sacrificed in order to get a weak pricing plan in place. Because a carbon price by itself, without regulations, without a program, without aggressive targets, isn't effective in reaching the Paris Agreement. So while we have our own domestic issues, I mean, you can imagine what it was like for me as a very disillusioned, very unhappy Canadian parliamentarian after Prime Minister Trudeau pulled his promise to deliver electoral reform. The next day, I was in the same room with President Donald Trump. And I have to say, nothing makes you love Justin Trudeau like being in the same room with Donald Trump.
Yes.
No, sure. And Elizabeth, tell us who you brought it for Daphne or for me.
For you first, Elizabeth. How do you, with all of the economic instability brought to Canada as a result of the Trump presidency, how do you convince the Canadian government to add the economic instability of taking further climate action beyond what it's already laid out? And is it fair that Canada will have to compensate for Trump?
Well, nothing about President Trump is fair. It's not fair that he's president and got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, but our electoral systems both leave a lot to be desired in fairness. But the reality of the economics is that further investment in fossil fuel infrastructure will be a loss to any government that puts its eggs in that basket. It is right now, the economics aren't there to justify, for instance, trying to ramp up coal. And I'll ask my colleague from the U.S. to comment on that as well. It's not going to be Canada alone pushing climate action. The European Union, China, the rest of the countries of the world, so in roughly 190 countries, are going to be pursuing the Paris Agreement and making it work, which means that they could, in concert, bring trade action and sanctions against any government that fails to live up to its Paris Agreement obligations. There are very real questions about whether Donald Trump will try to pull out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. He can't pull out of the Paris Agreement in less than 4 years. But he could pull out, theoretically, although no president has ever pulled out of a treaty that has been ratified by their Senate, which is the case for the Framework Convention on Climate Change. They could do various things within the U.S., but the global context will still be achieving climate action, and the economic pressures will be moving towards renewables. So it's the opposite of what Brad Wall is claiming. It is in Canada's economic interests, as well as in providing climate leadership, to pursue an agenda that takes us off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Now just pass it to...
Yeah, just in terms of coal, clearly the price of fracked gas is much lower than coal, and so the economics of pursuing the coal in our country are just not there. But I do want to add to what Elizabeth said in terms of what's happening at the subnational government. We have states such as California, the 6th largest economy in the world, that has signed an under 2 MOU, along with New York State, Oregon, Vermont, Washington. Quite a few state and city leaders are committed to the Paris Accords. So regardless of what happens at the federal level, the momentum is there. The economic momentum, the investments are there. People are divesting from fossil fuels. The Seattle City Council recently passed a divestment from Wells Fargo because of their investments in the Dakota Access Pipeline, amounting to $5 billion in divestment. So Trump can do all he wants at the federal level, but the states and cities are moving forward on what is very clearly in their area of jurisdiction, which is protecting the health and well-being of their citizens.
My second question again for Ms. Wysham. I'm sorry. What is it too early to panic about President Trump pulling out of some of these climate change conventions, frameworks, treaties? Given that, well, I guess my question is, how much power do the states and communities and cities have? What opportunities exist for them to lead the charge on climate change, even if they're not getting cooperation from the head of state?
Well, there are quite a few organizations, everything from the Compact of Mayors to the C40 cities that have agreed to move forward on the Paris Accords, as I said, regardless of what happens at the federal level. Now, keep in mind, we have, as the head of our State Department, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. So the question remains, would it be a good thing or a bad thing having the former CEO of ExxonMobil leading our climate negotiations at the international level? On some level, it may actually be better to not have him in the room because he could perhaps do more damage to the international negotiations were he to have a seat at the table. And that's, in fact, what Rex Tillerson has suggested that he wants to do, is stay in the negotiations. He has also signaled as recently as, I think, 10 years ago that he wanted to see a price on carbon. Whether or not that comes up again remains to be seen. But yes, the mayors and the states are moving forward with their firm commitment to climate action. And thanks to the Canadian scientists, I do want to say a special thanks to them. They have recovered and preserved the climate science that is now being scrubbed from U.S. government websites as we speak. And we're counting on that kind of collaboration and collegiality as we tackle what is perhaps the gravest threat to humankind. Thank you.
Apropos of Secretary of State Tillerson's views on carbon pricing, it was one of the pieces of information that I picked up in conversation with people in various offices in Washington, that they think it's quite possible, in fact, it's something that we don't talk about in Canada, that President Trump could bring in a carbon price for the U.S. They don't view this as good news because the scenario would be getting rid of all regulations, the Clean Air Act, getting rid of the things that protect people in the U.S. from respiratory illness, not just climate impacts of greenhouse gases, but the whole air agenda, and replace it with a carbon price and then say, okay, that's done then. But I do think that's a significant thing for Canadians to know, that our carbon price might be matched by one in the U.S. So it's not at all clear, and I say this to my friends in the Conservative Party in Canada, it's not at all clear that Donald Trump's presidency means that a carbon price will put Canada in any kind of disadvantage. Quite the contrary. But it's also would be quite wrong to suggest that if Trump does this and gets rid of all regulations, that this is somehow real climate action. You need, both in Canada and the U.S., to have real climate action. You need a carbon price, but that's just a foundational piece on top of which you need a real plan. You need regulations. You need, I'm hoping this budget later this month from Bill Morneau will give us the kinds of things we used to have, eco-energy efficiency programs for buildings, better inducements, tax rebates for buying fuel-efficient vehicles and electric vehicles. So there's a whole suite of measures that Canada still needs on top of a carbon price. But at this point, I think there is an actual prospect of President Trump bringing in a U.S. carbon price.
Another question. What the U.S. has, developing countries are already being told not to aspire to the level of consumerism and consumption that the U.S. has, lest they further the climate change and sustainability issues that the world is already facing. What dialogue or rhetoric or action exists right now to try and mitigate the effect of the U.S. withdrawing from climate commitment and climate action on those developing countries who are now going to say, well, not only are we supposed to not have what America has, now they're not even doing anything about it, and now we're supposed to do something about that too.
I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is important to respond to in response to your question is the fact that China alone is planning on investing $361 billion in renewable energy over the next 3 years. India is already blowing past its own goals, on pace to get 60% of its electricity from wind and solar within the next 10 years. Solar power is surging because, for the very simple reason, it is becoming the cheapest form of electricity on the globe. We now have 500,000 solar panels being installed around the world every single day. So when you talk about pitting, whether or not developing countries have the right to develop versus meeting their climate obligations, I think it's a false choice. I think actually what we should be looking at the analogy of the cell phone in developing countries, where countries like India didn't go through the landline and then to the cell phone. They went straight to the cell phone. The same can be said of developing countries around the world. They will get much better technology by going straight to renewables, to microgrids, These sorts of technological options are surging in places like Africa with great benefit, economic and environmental, to people in those countries. Did you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers the question. I agree. I would say that there is an equity piece to the Paris Agreement, and throughout it, I mean, the words climate justice were added at the very last minute in the very last draft. But I think it's an important component that as we go forward with, I think the economic arguments are unassailable, as Daphne's laid them out. But there will be places where you also want to look at climate justice in terms of loss and damage, which is the UN code for what do you do for a country whose development investments over a period of years are wiped out by a single extreme weather event that ends up being linked to climate change. And that's the loss and damage piece, which is an additional piece of financing that's still being negotiated alongside of the investments that the industrialized world has promised for adaptation to climate change. Clearly, one of the places where Trump's presidency automatically and clearly, unequivocally will hurt the most is in withdrawing money. He's threatened withdrawing money from the UN system, withdrawing money from Green Climate Fund money. The U.S. invented the idea under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Barack Obama in the lead up to Copenhagen. It was the U.S. that invented the idea that the industrialized world should pay out $100 billion a year starting in 2020 to help developing countries and ramp up to that from Copenhagen. That wasn't a demand from developing countries. Developing countries were demanding the U.S. reduce its emissions. So back to the kind of our ugly Copenhagen history, that was something that was put on the table by the U.S. And now the single largest donor to that fund can easily withdraw. That's something Trump can do, but there are many other countries stepping up in the same way that Trump killing funds for a woman's right to a legal, safe abortion in any country around the world where it was legal. Trump has now brought back the restrictions, I'm sure you know, that George Bush invented, that if a health center was offering access to an abortion, they couldn't get funding for anything else they're doing either. And the Dutch said, okay, if the Dutch government said, if that's what you're doing, we're starting a new fund to help make up that gap that just opened up. I hope in the same way that other countries will open up new funds to say we've got to make up for the gap of what the U.S. just did.
Yes. Who did just say who you?
Yeah. Just,
again for you,
okay,
Daphne. What's going to happen to federal funding in the states for climate organizations, environmental research? Is funding going to be halted on current projects? What's that going to look like in the next 4 years, or is it too early to tell?
So you're talking about government funding. Yeah, I mean, it's too early to tell, but it does look like there will be severe cuts in funding for all of the government agencies that are dealing with the climate crisis. As I mentioned, we've got climate denialists now heading up the Environmental Protection Agency, an appointment looming of someone from one of the Koch brothers institutes who is now in line to head up the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a climate denialist. One can assume that all of the heads of all of these agencies will have climate action in their crosshairs. That being said, there is a bureaucracy of devoted government servants who actually can slow things down quite dramatically at the government level, and probably will do so. So we'll have to see how that plays out. We've heard that government employees are using text messaging that's coded so that their bosses can't surveil their activity. So, this is the state of affairs in our country. As I said, it's completely unprecedented. And we really do need Canada to stand strong, to support nonprofit groups as well as government groups, as the scientists have, in standing up to Trump, and specifically locally elected officials who are taking very bold and courageous actions in standing up to the fossil fuel industry. As I mentioned, we have over 30 elected officials who've done this at great risk to themselves politically, but you can find that list of names at nonewffi.org. That's our website where we have all of the elected officials listed. We would love to get more elected officials throughout the U.S. and Canada signed on, pledging to take similar action. This is about the health and safety of our communities. Portland, Oregon was being threatened by Pembina Pipeline Corporation's propane export terminal. It was a extremely reckless and hazardous proposal to build a huge propane terminal in an earthquake subduction zone. Thankfully, in bringing mile-long trains of propane down the Columbia Gorge past schools and hospitals, thankfully we killed that in the name of our health and safety, and it's one reason we've imposed a ban on all new fossil fuel export infrastructure in the city of Portland. But we've inspired other cities to do the same, and just as Lac Mégantic suffered the horrors of an oil train derailment, it's up to all of us at the local level to stand up for our right to a healthy, safe environment.
I'll add just really quickly that the divestment campaigns are also continuing on campuses. There's tremendous momentum around divesting from fossil fuels. I think Canadians need to look at what's happening to our Canada pension plan, because we have, as you know, an independent board that is actually looking at our pension plan money, which should be, I think, at a low rate of return but safe from the vagaries of investing in stocks and seeing what happens. We now have a running Canada pension plan, investors who are looking for where do we make our best rate of return. So and now headed by someone who favors fairly risky investments. I think Canadians need to shine a light on where do our investment dollars go in the Canada pension plan. How do we ensure that they're not in investments that are risky, and how do we ensure that we divest from fossil fuels for our own pension savings? But there are a lot of other avenues to explore. Just one last quick thing, of course, is that the Lac Mégantic train was loaded with Bakken shale, and that made it uniquely explosive. Had that train been loaded with bitumen, it would have caused only physical damage of crashing into something. It could never have caught fire. So I still regret very much that whoever prepared Prime Minister Trudeau's talking points for his announcement on Kinder Morgan misled him, because it was simply not true to say, as he did in that press conference, that Kinder Morgan will be safer because pipelines are safer than rail. In the case of bitumen, it's the opposite.